Welcome to the latest episode of Lateral Think, brought to you by Melbourne Athletic Development. Melbourne Athletic Development is a sports and injury management clinic based in Melbourne, Australia. To maximise your performance, optimise your injury management, contact the team at Melbourne Athletic Development. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development podcast. Jack?
How are you, John?
Very good, mate. So today we thought we would talk about biomechanics and its relation to running injuries specifically. I know we've talked about running before in a couple of podcasts, one about sprinting, one about running specifically. That was more sort of probably tailored at general running or distance running. And we thought we'd talk about some of the more specifics associated with biomechanics that actually do contribute to injury, because we get that question a lot of, you know, we often do running assessments, or we do a lot of running assessments, and we do a lot of work looking at people who come in who are runners who have injuries already. And we take the time to understand, okay, what do we think might be contributing from a biomechanical standpoint? But I think there's some general ideas and some general rules to kind of look at. And there's also probably some opportunities to give people some, you know, guidelines on how they can approach that.
Yeah, and look, it's actually probably a good question to start with, but something that's clear is a lot of people develop or adopt quite poor running mechanics in general, and there's clearly better ways to run than others. But that's actually an interesting question to consider is, why don't we run more effectively naturally? Why isn't it just like a innate ability?
Well, it obviously is an innate ability. Everyone can run. Or has the ability to run, but it's obviously going to be heavily influenced by lots of other factors, some of them developmental, some of them genetic predispositions.
I guess footwear is a big one too.
Well, footwear is an interesting idea. Obviously, we've gone through this evolution recently of super shoes, particularly, you know, we'll talk a little bit about sprint-related biomechanics in this, I'm sure, but most of this will probably talk about distance running because it's more approachable for most people, and it's probably what most people are involved in. And the thing that's interesting about it is we've seen an explosion of performance that is very heavily related to shoes. And the key variable that seems to be driving the development of performance with these shoes seems to be the amount of energy that you get back from these new technology foams. And that in itself gives you a really strong understanding of one of the key things that maybe we need to train.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was thinking from the perspective too of having quite supported or cushioned shoes too, of how that impacts foot and ankle mechanics in particular, particularly through development, and like even thinking from the standpoint of developing, say, foot and ankle strength and stiffness, and how that then has implications for how you run through.
Well, it's quite funny you say that, because yesterday I saw a video of the Maasai warriors jumping up and down, and then you know, another obviously someone from you know, another country trying to actually do some of the jumping they were doing, and they were getting off the ground only, you know, 10 centimeters, and you know,
was that me?
Yeah, it was probably one of us, wasn't it? But it was really interesting because clearly that's a, you know, the cultural sort of practice that they have of that sort of jumping type dance movement that they do is so, one, it's so impressive, but two, it shows you that if you adopt certain behaviours, you will adapt, and as you said, you'll develop the, you know, ankle mechanics, the calf mechanics, the ability to be able to bounce off the ground really effectively.
There's actually a question, good place to start, because I think of, say, East African countries, like Kenya is obviously a prime example of this, of producing a lot of really good runners, and you'll know more this about me than me, so correct me if there's some issues in my facts here, but there's a lot of really good runners that come from a particular region within Kenya, and
yeah, the Rift Valley.
Yeah, and like they adopt running from a very early age, even like as a mode of transportation, like getting to and from school.
Yeah, so yeah, keep going.
And so I was interested, like, from people that have actually done observations of this group, do they actually adopt footwear from a very young age, or?
I think their footwear is pretty rudimentary. They do wear footwear. It's not that they don't. They're not sort of living tribes anymore. Obviously, we mentioned the Maasai warriors, but they're in a different part of Kenya.
Yep.
So they wear footwear. I'm sure it's probably not the super shoes, but they're wearing sort of, even from a young age, they're wearing school shoes or whatever, and a lot of them will just run in whatever they've got. So if they're going to school, they'll run in their school shoes.
Sure.
I think that brings a really important point, which is there are social factors that heavily influence the development of certain behavioural traits, and some of them are related to sport. And then there's obviously cultural factors as well. And then obviously there's huge genetic ones. And there's the geographical factor too. So, like say the Rift Valley, but really where they are is very, very high altitude. And they live there. They grow up there, they develop their running capability there. They already have a lot of the changes that do occur that are beneficial for the development of some of those cardiorespiratory changes and cardiovascular changes that are beneficial to endurance capability from living at that altitude their whole life.
Is their performance also reflective on the mechanics of how they move, or do you think it's more of some of those other factors you just mentioned?
Well, yes, it is, but not in the sense that they run differently to other people. Interestingly, you say that I had a discussion actually only last week with one of the biomechanists from the Institute of Sport, and he was saying there was a case study done with a couple of Kenyans from the World Championships, I believe, and what they did was they showed that in their kick down for the last lap of, I think it was either the 5 or the 10K on the track, they actually adopted longer contact times, which usually longer contact at times are associated with slower running. And it was quite interesting. They were saying they sort of adopted this in order to maybe like increase their stride length. It obviously wasn't going to probably increase their stride rate.
Yes.
And that suggests that maybe it was unique to those two individual athletes because they didn't find anyone else in the actual race do that, and these were the two that were leading. Whether that had developed because they were more distance focused and their idea of actually trying to improve performance was to actually spend more time on the ground and push. So is that unique to those sort of individual athletes, or is that actually some sort of, as you said, related to their underlying anthropometric features because of their genetic profile? One of the things that we know, this is one of the reasons that we see significant overrepresentation of, in distance running, East African, and then obviously in speed power events, West African athletes, is because a lot of the anthropometric features are actually beneficial in these sports. So I know for those people who've read The Sports Gene by David Epstein, they'll know there's like a really interesting kind of points that he makes about the leg length of these athletes. So he was saying how some of the African distance runners had their leg length was as long as, for some of them, was as long as some of the other athletes who were in sports where that didn't matter, like swimming, for instance. They usually have a longer torso and shorter legs. They had the same leg length as someone who was like a foot taller than them, basically. It was really interesting. They were able to, they were wearing the same length pants. And that was, it's because their torso is really short, their legs are really long in comparison, versus in other sports where it may be beneficial, say for swimming, to have a longer torso and longer arms and things like that rather than have longer legs. And those kind of features are built into the genetic makeup of those areas, and that's why you see an overrepresentation. They're actually designed in a way that is beneficial for that activity. It's just, in the book he also talks about the concept of like in basketball, one of the metrics that's actually useful in terms of anthropometrics is wingspan. And I know you've spoken about this because you follow a little bit of the NBA stuff of some of the players that, and actually, who was the example he gave of the guy who was playing center, but he was not that tall. However, his arm length was much greater. Do you remember that example?
Well, there's quite a few of those people. But like, it's more the ratio is sometimes so disproportionate.
They're still tall, so they might be 6'10", but their arm length is like
7'6" or something. Yeah,
and so for that reason, they can actually play center versus a player who's 4, 5, 6 inches taller than them and actually be able to outperform them in the tap because they have the arm length to be able to support that.
And also just the defensive advantage too. Like even for if you're a point guard and you're only 6'2", but you've got a 6'6" wingspan, your ability to be able to grab the ball.
Over, yeah.
Or no, also like if you're defending too,
because
in terms of being able to try to steal the ball from someone, it's probably quite misleading because someone like me, usually competing against people with normal wingspans, you think if you've got the ball in this position, they can't reach relative to where their body position is, but perhaps they can.
Yeah. And I think those kind of features are some of the factors that we see biomechanical differences because they have very different anthropometric structures. And so a clear one, which is obvious to muscle physiology, is you see with, and it tends to be runners in general, so it's greater propensity in African, both East and West, but you do see it in obviously Caucasian or Asian athletes as well, who have particularly in the lower leg, very long Achilles tendon structure with quite a high, small muscle bulk of their gastrocnemius.
Yeah.
And the advantage that has for the amount of force that they can generate at the foot, particularly at very high rates of force development because of the stretch structures or the stretching of those structures around that foot, ankle, calf complex, means that they have a huge improvement in distance running for running economy, and in speed events they have a huge improvement in their stiffness properties and the force that they can impart in really short periods of time.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I think, understanding a little bit of that gives you an idea of where you maybe need to look in terms of who the people are that are going to have not that the people can't perform well without those features, but maybe are going to have advantages that you can amplify through some sort of training methodology.
Yeah. Do you think that gives you insight into people's potential ceiling too?
Well, definitely.
It's like the early factor, of course, but
and as I said, I've been working closely with the biomechanists, and we're talking about this concept because we were in sprinting and he was at the track. We were looking at different things, and we were going through ideas around like stride length and stride frequency. And I said to him, because he brought up the genetic thing. He's like, oh, well, maybe we're just limited in this country because of the genetic factor. And I said, yeah, that's true. But I think there's been enough example of athletes almost being developed into having some of the features or having to work around it and understanding what they need to do. So I gave him the example of the Chinese sprinter Xu Bingtian, who at the recent Olympics ran 9:83, ran the fastest ever 60 meters, sort of blew up in the final, unfortunately, but if he had have run the same performance he ran in the semi-final, he would have won a medal, right? And there's a really good, it's something that someone else has kind of made, but it's sort of short documentary sort of thing on YouTube where he talks through some of the stuff of how he actually had to make a lot of changes, and it brings up his coach, Randy Huntington, who basically said, look, you've got these disadvantages. One is your leg length, one's your height, but you've got some good things about what you do. Like he's got really high natural frequencies or stride, frequency capability. And we think that we can develop the other features enough. And he was able to take a guy who was talented. He's a guy that was running 10 or 10-1. So it's not that you can turn up and take, you or I and say, okay, we're going to build these features and they're going to run, 9-8. They're not going to do that. And we're not going to do that. But what you can do is if you've got someone who's like, okay, they're actually already skewing towards a high probability of good performance, what can we amplify even with what they've got not necessarily being already developed? And I think the same thing happens in both distance running and in sprints or speed power events, where you just actually have to work out what are the main drivers of those things. And we know in all running, the key thing is velocity, right? The higher velocity you can run at, the better you're going to perform. In an endurance event, what's the velocity that you can hold for the longest amount of time? If that's higher than everyone else, you're going to win. Generally in a sprint, it's the same thing. If you can hit a higher velocity than most other people, you're going to actually probably win most races.
Actually, just on that point, you made me think when you mentioned about the changes in ground contact times and therefore stride frequency in the two Kenyan athletes in was it the 5,000 or the 10,000?
It was one of those events. I can't remember which one, but it was like their last lap. They sort of looked at they took off and they ran away from everyone.
So their velocity did increase, and they did actually get a
the velocity
change.
increased, but they'd obviously done that. I didn't look at the data specifically, but I think the point we're making is they probably increased their stride length more than they increased their frequency.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, they spent more time on the ground to propel themselves.
Which is kind of counterintuitive to how most people think about it. Okay, no, the point I was going to make is that reflective of how they've developed variability in their ability to produce force to be able to maintain a high output over a longer duration event? Because, one of those elements that's particularly associated with reducing injury is having complexity or variability in your movement patterns, but that's probably maybe more of an example of a particular strategy that they use to increase their velocity as opposed to having variability.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The thing that I think it highlights, and as I said, the thing that you need to do is maximize velocity capability, whether it's endure that velocity or obviously just produce that velocity. And the basic equation for that is stride length multiplied by stride frequency. And the stride frequency is something that you can adapt. It does change. It's not something that may change too much. It's usually heavily related to your anthropometrics, because the longer your levers, the slower they're going to turn. That's why when Usain Bolt was, at his peak, the thing that people was surprised by was the frequencies that he could create being 6'5".
Yeah.
The thing that obviously the advantage you have if you're taller versus shorter is you're going to have naturally longer stride lengths. And we've spoken about this in our previous discussions on running, that usually that's a really basic ratio of your height, or more accurate is probably your leg length, but your height is usually a general idea for it. So in maximal sprints, you're looking at around, the elites are sort of around that 1.3 times their body height. Some are a little bit more, some are a little bit less. And in order to achieve similar velocities, they either turn up or turn down the frequency depending on whether that, 1.3 is 1.35 or 1.25. And you see the men are slightly higher than the women, but there are some women who do have longer stride lengths comparative to their height.
On that note, thinking about specific running parameters with regards to injury, do you think simple parameters like stride length and stride frequency are really important for injury, or do you think it's more related to more the spatio-temporal elements in terms of angles and position? Well, sorry, I'm talking more in terms of not just in terms of the length or the frequency of your move, but the actual joint angle and positions and the positions that you make ground contact. Kinematic features. Yeah,
so I think, all right, it's good you brought that up, because let's define terms to start with. There's three factors really. There's other obviously things you can look at in biomechanics, but there's three major areas of biomechanics that I always talk to people about. The ones that have become really popular are kinematics, which is, as you said, joint positions and angles. So people now have gotten into the idea of understanding, okay, I can get the iPad out, I can get the video out, I can look at this. So this is where their knee is, this is how much joint angle their hips are dropping, or they're rotating through their trunk or whatever. So that starts to give you an idea of things in relation to each other and the different angles, your obliquative, say for instance, of your pelvis, or what's going on with that. The second part is the kinetics, which people have some understanding of now that it's becoming more popular to use technology. So we're looking there at forces and the different relations of force application, moments, accelerations. We're seeing those things. And the technology, we'll talk about it probably when we get a little bit further in, about the idea of, okay, how do we measure these things? And the third part is what you mentioned, is the spatiotemporal features, which is the things like contact time, flight time, stride length, stride frequency. And
because it seems like we hear a lot at the moment, something that you hear a lot of people advocating for is changing stride frequency, and specifically increasing stride frequency to reduce injury rates. And these are things like Achilles tendon pain, or even potentially, what are the other common ones that you experience? Potentially even things like...
well, we'll go through that, because I think that leads into the next session, which is identifying, one, how do we measure these things? And then I think the thing we go to is maybe, okay, what are some examples of the certain types of injuries that we see?
Yeah.
But the main thing that usually trying to do is cut down overstriding, right? So typically one of the things that leads to a lot of injury presentations is people who they are probably striding further than what their capability to do so is.
Yep.
And that may be for a few different factors. At a really simplistic level, the basic equation that I always say to people is that your biomechanical outputs are a combination of your, sensory motor outputs, so your skills. Can you coordinate yourself? Can you move? Do you know what you're meant to be doing when you're running along?
Yep.
And your tissue properties.
Yes.
Do you have tissue compliance? Are you flexible? Are you strong? Are you powerful? Are you elastic? Those kind of things. Joint angle, like joint capabilities, all those things. If those two things come together and you add them together, you'll get an understanding of what you observe biomechanically. Now, there are other features that can, like fatigue obviously isn't a major feature that may influence that, but at a basic observable level, those are the two major things that I think contribute. Now, when you've got that in mind, then you can start to think about why you might necessarily change something or when you need to start looking at that. So if someone, for instance, is overstriding, is that because conceptually they don't understand what they're supposed to be doing and they've fallen into a pattern of throwing their leg out ahead of their center of mass and then breaking, and then that's causing a lot of amortization of their joints and they're not stacking their joints well, and then there's a whole shift in what happens in the stretch shorten cycle and all that kind of stuff? Or is it that they actually don't have the projection capability because of a lack of power or elastic function or stiffness properties of their limb?
Yeah, so even though you could give a simple cue like, I want you to increase your stride frequency, i.e. a spatiotemporal variable, you would see a change in their kinematics because they're not going to have the ability to potentially overstride. That may be an oversimplification of trying to understand, well, why is it that they may be overstriding in the first place?
And that's why I think you've got to go to that next level. I'm lucky enough, they invite me along to help out with the Sports Masters program at Lateral. I usually go once a year. Done it a couple of times now to do some talking about running and go through some practical stuff with the group. It's good fun and I enjoy it. But one of the things, someone brought this up and they said, I've seen the recommendations for this and I think it's useful. I said, okay, what do you think is the effect on the actual running economy of that athlete? What do you think is the effect on their performance? And, how do you think that their actual race result or their running result will go if you increase their frequency significantly?
Yeah.
And they said, I didn't think about that. I said, you need to understand that you've got to put this in the context of, you've got two aims, I think, when you're trying to work with people on biomechanics. One is to obviously hopefully reduce injury risk and or potentially manage an injury that's currently come up and you're trying to change that in a positive manner. The second thing is to try and improve performance, right? And you can't rob Peter to pay Paul. You can't say, I'm going to make them run really slow because they're turning over and going up and down on the spot, but they're not getting injured, so that's worth it.
Yeah, and I think what you're highlighting here too is when you identify a problem, it's good to use that framework of thinking about the spatiotemporal components, the kinetic and the kinematic components, and think about, well, how do I try and quantify or determine each of these subsystems, well, not subsystems, they're all very interconnected, obviously, but again, try to identify what are the key modulators that are associated with the particular pattern that someone assumes, because that may be related to changing things like stride length or frequency, that may be related to kinematics, that may be related to just the actual overall tissue capacity or properties of that person, and probably more often than not, it's a combination of the three because they're going to influence each other.
So I think that's perfect because I think what this allows us now to do is talk about how do we measure those things.
Yeah.
So I think if you're looking at each of those features, if we start with, say, kinematics, I think the most common one for people to use is, say, 2D video, right? And it's become a lot more popular because there's now a lot of programs, a lot of applications that are accessible on, your mobile phone, on tablet, and there's a number of things applications you can use on your computer as well. So that's probably the key one. And I think my recommendation to people generally is that's a really good starting point. Actually get an understanding of what's happening in relation to the different, positions of the body, different distances, what's going on with those things, right? That's going to give you a lot of information. It gives you some of the spatiotemporal features, and it's also gives you opportunity to explore those, and it gives you the opportunity to explore some of the kinematic features.
Yeah.
obviously, if you want to go up in levels of, acuity, you would go to something like 3D analysis, which, these days is getting easier with AI. I know companies like ViewMotion, for instance, are starting to put AI constructs on vision that's taken from 2D video.
Yes.
OpenPose is another one that has developed a lot of that technology to be able to not have to use markers. But people would remember, for instance, Vicon systems that had the specific markers that would give researchers, particularly usually in a research setting, the opportunity to see, okay, what's this joint doing in relation to the XYZ axis? Like, what's actually happening there? So those features there are really valuable in giving you that general idea and general view. The big thing that I would recommend with it is take views from different positions. So side on is the most common that people take, but take some from the front, take them from the back. If there's opportunity, people talk about doing it even from the top. It's a bit hard to do, I think, for most people in most settings. Maybe not so much. People use a lot of drones.
Yeah, sure.
For videoing, even training and things like that. And you get an idea of what's happening in lots of different planes. You get the opportunity to see sagittal plane, frontal and transverse planes. And that's interesting in itself. So once you've got that, that gives you an idea of, okay, are the movements that I'm seeing in relation to other parts of that body actually happening in some sort of uniform and congruent fashion? Because if they're not, that it starts to become alarm bells, right? And we see typically where one joint or one area of tissue is actually going through, say, more range or more stress or more velocity than another area. Typically, you get an accumulation or an overemphasis of stress, particularly biomechanical stress in that area. So an example I would give, we'll talk more about specific injuries in a moment, but an example I would give is, people who tend to develop ITB pain, right? So iliotibial band pain, runner's knee in distance running, tend to have two key features that they often have kinematically. They have an increase in the amount of knee flexion at mid-stance, right? And they tend to have a step width decrease, meaning they have a greater, say, Q angle, or, people will talk about adduction of the hip, right? So typically, if you see those two features, they are common contributors, common kinematic, and one's a spatiotemporal feature in step width itself, but common features that come up with a development of, say, lateral knee pain with ITB type irritation. And that's really observable very simply from looking at video, even 2D video from the side and from the front. And you see that, you can actually get an idea of okay, there's something that I can maybe address here if they're developing this kind of pain. Now, you need to look at, again, is it the skill component? Is it that they actually have tissue capability issues where they're coming into a lot of hip adduction or their knees flexing more than what you would expect and yielding more than you expect because they actually don't have some of the strength properties or the power properties to be able to absorb, or eccentric strength properties to absorb that effectively and not lose too much of that joint. Not have too much of that joint range occurring through that mid stance. So that's one thing that you could sort of look at it. In terms of looking at some of those, before I move on, actually, in terms of video, I really recommend most phones now and most tablets, you can get at least 60 to 120 frames per second. Try and take it at a higher frame rate. You'll get more idea of what's going on. And if you have programs like one that I use quite often, transferring from my phone to the computer is Kinovia. It's an open source software for biomechanical analysis. If you take enough, if your frame rate is high enough, you can actually do even some of the spatiotemporal features we'll talk about in a second. That like stride length and stride frequency, you can actually do those calculations pretty easily because you actually have a relatively accurate view on it. And that's actually how things like ViewMotion are starting to get those features because they're actually recognizing, okay, the foot's on the ground now. Okay, now it's off the ground. They time that feature, do some basic mathematics and go, okay, this is what their stride frequency currently is. So the second feature obviously is kinetics, and that's obviously the forces. Now, typically that was something that was always measured more in the lab. We're seeing, force plates becoming more popular, so it's something that people are able to do. I still don't know of too many places that have open access to, say, like overground force plates. A lot of them are instrumented treadmills. There are places that obviously do have the force plates, but not over an extended distance. Most of them have it over about a 10 or 15 meters. They've got maybe 4 or 5 force plates in a row. The cool one, I think I've mentioned this before in the sprint podcast, is Ryu Nagahara in Japan. He's got like 50 meters of force plates in the laboratory that they've developed there, which has given such a ridiculously awesome amount of in-depth data on sprint research. But those features are now becoming easier to measure because we're getting people validating applications to be able to do these calculations. So things like people like Pierre Samazino and JB Morin have developed things like the force velocity curve on an application like MySprint. And that's become something that people are using to work out a force velocity profile for acceleration for different athletes of different sports. And that gives you an idea of, okay, maybe this person is generating this acceleration through more of a velocity approach versus more of a force application approach. And it's giving you maybe some indications on what kind of training you should look at and all those kind of things.
One question that I wanted to ask you with regards to assessing running mechanics is 2 things. One, depending on the athlete, you may identify a lot of biomechanical faults that you want to address. And in those situations, where should you start? And do you think that, do you follow particular principles of starting from the foot up or working in a particular pattern of how you go about doing it? And associated with that question is, when is it appropriate to change someone's running mechanics?
All right, let's answer those separately.
Yeah.
In terms of when it's actually, let's start in the first one. Basically, I tend to look ground up. All right, and that's mainly because the things that happen on the ground tend to have more influence on what's happening in the air than the things that happen in the air influencing what happens on the ground. Now, it's not to say that they don't both influence, and you shouldn't necessarily be doing work to facilitate skill acquisition and improvement across both.
Well, imagine there are cases, exceptions of, let's say someone's broken their arm and it's affected their upper limb mechanics. That can have implications for the lower limb mechanics where you might be working from the top down. But that's totally. Probably an exception to the rule.
Yeah. But generally I work ground up, but it doesn't mean I'm not looking at pelvis, spine, trunk, torso, arms, shoulder, what's happening at the head, all those kind of things. You're looking at those, but I usually go ground up. I'm trying to look at the idea of, okay, where is this foot landing in relation to the center of mass? What's happening in terms of the rotations about the different joints? How much stiffness loss or how much height loss is there throughout the actual cycle of the motion? What's happening in different points of the actual stride? And I'm trying to work out, okay, if they are able to carry out these features from the ground, what is that meaning for what's happening in the air? And then obviously the sequence of what happens in a consequent step and all those kind of things.
Again, an overgeneralization, but do you think it's fair to say that poor foot ankle mechanics is where you get the most energy leakage, and so you're going to get compensation further up the chain to accommodate for that if you have poor foot ankle mechanics?
Yeah, I would say so. I don't have the exact data to back that up. I have looked at some research at some of the ideas of what happens with that, but generally you do tend to see that what happens through the foot and ankle tends to go up the chain. And we'll get onto it, but it's one of the features that I think is where you can probably make a lot of changes that are beneficial without necessarily doing a hell of a lot to change someone's overall sort of style or shape of what they do.
Yeah.
Because you ask the question, when should you change it? And I think generally there's kind of probably 2 reasons to change something. One is, and we're obviously talking about injuries, if someone's having an injury and there's a clear biomechanical, structural overload that you're seeing, where, as we said before about, say, like the ITB, you can see that they're really dropping their height through their knee, and it's maybe even more emphasized on one side as they step on that side, and they say like very big or very small, for instance, stride width, then in the presence of injury, I think the opportunity is there for you to explore making some alterations. Now, those alterations may not be large, and we've spoken a lot about safe-to-fail experiments. What are small alterations that you can make that are not going to affect performance negatively, and or potentially are beneficial to performance, and are potentially going to have effect on changing running mechanics in a beneficial way for the injury? So in that example, I would talk to people about something really simple. If you're actually on the track, or even they're running around a football, surface of a football pitch or soccer pitch or something like that, actually saying to them, okay, I want you to run on the line, and I want you to take note of where your foot lands with each foot in relation to that line. Now, I don't want you to be on either side of the line, but I want the inside edge of your foot to be touching, say, the outer third of that line or something like that.
Yep.
And so it kind of keeps enough space. If they go, oh no, I step in the middle of the line every time, it's like, okay, well, that step width is too narrow. I want you to be sort of on the outer edge of it and see whether that has an effect. So it's stuff like that. And then the other big one that, as I said, is where you see something that maybe hasn't turned into a pathological problem, but it's starting to shift towards an area where you think it's outside. And I say this very loosely, but a bandwidth that you think is reasonable, right? So someone may be getting away with a performance decrement for a period of time, and it's usually because they have some of the tissue, properties or qualities that they need to be able to perform at a high level, or they're overdeveloped, and so they can get away with it. But ultimately, it's going to affect their performance if it's outside those things. And there are general principles that I think that you can work towards in biomechanics. And one of the key ones for running athletes is that gravity is pulling you to the ground. Now, when you land on the ground and gravity pulls you to the ground, are you doing that in a relatively controlled and sequenced and congruent fashion, or are you doing that in an unsequenced, uncontrolled, non-congruent fashion? Because if you see all of a sudden, their hips really drop, and that means that the knee's really flexed, but the ankle doesn't move at all, or they're having a lot of rotation on one side in their trunk or shoulder or something like that, that starts to open up the idea of, okay, that's not very congruent. And in something that already, like walking, we know comes from pattern generation of the spine. Running has a very similar kind of contribution from reflexive patterns. One of the big ones that we talk about a lot in sprinting is the cross-extensor reflex, where if you really evoke a very hard flexion or a very hard extension of the limb, particularly whether it be the arm or the leg or the hip, for instance, it will cause the opposite side to actually do the opposite movement. And by evoking that, you actually can create patterns and movements without a lot of energy expenditure.
Yeah.
So if we're seeing a very big incongruence and a lot of asymmetry, that starts to give us ideas that potentially not only is there energy leaks, as you said, but there's big opportunities for stressing one particular area more than what you would like. And people will only get away with that for so long. So someone's like, I've never had an injury. And it's like, okay, well, you're leaking a lot of energy here, so maybe we should start to look at that. And again, we spoke about it just before. Run small experiments, right? Try little things. Don't wholeheartedly go, no, the way you run's bad, I'm going to change everything. Pick small things that you think that you can have an influence on. And as I said, for me, the really, really simple cues tend to have the biggest effect, especially if you target them at the area that has, in my mind, the most influence, which is what you do on the ground. So now if we go all the way back, we still haven't spoken about collecting data for spatiotemporal features.
Yeah.
Again, as I said, I think the video is one. There are other things that are, and even so the kinetics, if we go back to it, is there are other things that are coming out. We're seeing even with, say, GPS units are giving us velocities and things, but they're giving us, now a lot of them have accelerometers in them and gyroscopes that give you an idea of impacts and things like that, and accelerations and decelerations. The same thing is with, it's become really popular to have these IMUs, the inertial moment units, that give you an idea of the accelerations that happen in those three different planes of motion, to get at least conceptually what's happening with that body and that person as they move. We're seeing a lot of ideas of this being put into shoe technology. We spoke to Adam about this when he said, he was working with ASICS about the concept of potentially putting this into a shoe to actually give people data on what's happening, like with their foot, what's the ground reaction force like? What's happening with those features? So that's where you get some of those kinetic features. And then finally, as we said, the spatiotemporal items, typically you can take them off, say, video, but you can obviously measure those things using some of these sort of measurement units. The other big one is there are a number of ways in which you can calculate contact time. One, as it's becoming more popular, is things like AI, but a major one is actually there's a number of different technologies that will actually pick up on those features. So we mentioned there's force plates, but there's one called OptoJump that actually is quite expensive, but it actually allows you to take really, really accurate readings of someone's flight time, contact time, and give you an idea of like the velocity that they're moving at and all those kind of things.
Talking about running mechanics and talking about these different variables, do we need to look at running mechanics differently based on the particular athlete and the sport that they do, like in terms of a field athlete versus a sprinter versus a distance runner? Or do you think there's some similar principles that can apply across the board to all these different types of sports?
There's similar principles. So I think that's one of the mistakes that people make. And the reason that I say that is, now there are unique individuals where you have to consider the different variables, like we mentioned before about anthropometrics. But essentially you're trying to achieve the same thing. And what you're trying to achieve is you're trying to propel yourself through space in, we've spoken about this before, but, the definition of running is, the ability to propel yourself through space continuously, whether it's at a very high velocity or, endure a particular velocity. In a movement that is highly coordinated and unstable in nature. So it requires the skill to be able to do that, and it requires you to be able to continue that. And the things that typically, once you start running, the two things that usually slow you down, one, obviously there's the gravitational force, there's wind resistance, and there's energy or fatigue that are going to play the factors in why you actually slow down or stop.
Yeah.
So as long as you understand that those things are pretty central structures, they're not going to change, and the physics isn't probably going to change unless you go into a black hole or something like that. You actually need to abide by those principles. So I think that gives you confidence when you're observing these things, because it gives you an opportunity to say, well, there are certain key principles that if I stick to, I can't really go too wrong. And that's why when you're observing running and you're, say, assessing someone for injury, it becomes really very obvious why someone develops an injury from a biomechanical standpoint.
Yeah, okay.
And that's why, like, if you assess those things and they're not really too far outside those bandwidths, then the likely contribution is not high, unless you have someone who's, and this is the differentiation, I think, between, distance injuries and high velocity injuries, is obviously the magnitude of the forces is very different.
And I'm about to say, so with field sports, depending where they fit on that spectrum is going to be reflective of the type of running related injuries that they get, whether they're more on that distance end or more on that speed power end.
Going on to injuries, I think that's where we can kind of start to look at it. If you say, okay, well, we know in distance related injuries, because the magnitude of the forces that you're experiencing, from a biomechanical standpoint, are lower, typically it means you don't get acute failure. And when I say acute failure, you don't get muscle strain type injuries. You don't get tendon ruptures. You don't get these kind of injuries that we see in high velocity sports. Which is
actually kind of interesting in a way, because it's not like the ground reaction forces are low. They may be relatively lower to sprinting, but they're still magnitudes higher than, say, body weight.
Yes, but they're half.
Yeah, no.
Sometimes more.
Sure.
Sometimes less than half. So you think if you double, a force application, it's probably going to have an effect.
Yeah, of course. But it's still an interesting thing to consider that the magnitudes of forces are still very high, even though they're still relatively quite lower compared to sprinting.
And I just think like actually the limb velocities are so much lower, and they're not, well, they are significantly lower. It takes away particularly a lot of the issues that you see with the muscular tendon, its unit, and the properties that it needs to have to be able to support those kind of velocities. You know, we've spoken before about the work of, say, Keith Barr and his concepts around, you know, what the function of the tendon is at different types of activities, you know, versus, you know, isometric versus eccentric versus concentric, and at different velocities.
Yeah.
You know, we know that the tendon has to act in a particular way at a very high velocity compared to at a very low velocity.
And even the actual muscle tendon complex we're talking about, of say, like thinking of a good example is like tibialis anterior versus the calf Achilles complex, where tibialis anterior is seen much more as positional because it's trying to maintain a certain joint angle, where the Achilles is much more related to about propulsion. Energy, and obviously energy storage and release.
So I think those things give you, as I said, they give you confidence to be able to look at something and go, this is, you know, what I'm looking for. And that's why, like, for instance, small variations in how someone, say, does a high intensity activity may lead to some sort of acute failure still reasonably easily. Whereas with, and this is the caveat, we've spoken about stress, you know, stress life curves before. Which is, you know, if you have very high magnitude stress, you don't need many cycles of that stress in order for something to actually fail. And then vice versa, if you're looking at something like endurance running, you know, you can actually have something that isn't, you know, perfectly symmetrical, congruent in terms of someone's kinematics, but until you do a certain volume of training, you don't necessarily see an injury develop. And if that develops, it's usually an overuse injury. It's a degradation of a tendon structure. It's a, you know, irritation to a joint or an irritation to a retinaculum, or some sort of myotendinous structure, or it's the development of bone stress in particular is a very common one.
So actually, with that in mind, do you think it's a fair statement to make that the bandwidth that you can get away with certain running mechanics is also dependent at the speed at which you move? So if you're a distance runner, you probably can have a bit more bandwidth with how you run and potentially not have negative implications to an injury versus, say, a sprinter, particularly if you're a good sprinter who can actually reach some pretty fast speeds. Your ability to go outside a certain bandwidth in your running mechanics really significantly increases your susceptibility to injury.
Yes. And the thing is, sprint performance is self-selecting in that sense because it's mechanics will limit how fast you can actually go. So if you can't actually get good mechanics, not only will you get injured, but you will also not run very fast. So you will be self-selected out of that task. Whereas within distance running, you can have people with very poor mechanics because the thing that's limiting them is not their maximal velocity. It's their ability to maintain a particular velocity that's competitive. So if they can develop and they over-index on their endurance capabilities, they can often get away with, as you said, a more variable running mechanics. That's why distance runners in particular tend to struggle to understand the concept that they need to work on running mechanics. Most of them have very little understanding of running mechanics, and most of them, it's getting a lot better, which is great. And there are a lot more coaches that are getting interested in it, but there are a lot of them that don't work on this stuff at all. And they just say, well, you just need to run more. You just need to do more reps. You know, we just need to get you fitter. We just need to push these entities in your training, and that will make the effect. Where you could probably change some of their running mechanics to improve performance quite significantly without actually doing any endurance training, without even shifting some of the measures of your running economy from a energetic standpoint.
Speaking of changing mechanics, we talked a little bit about when you should and when you shouldn't, but the other thing too is how much you should change it. Are there particular characteristics that you identified that give you an indication of I can be more aggressive with trying to change this person's mechanics versus I actually need to do this in a very slow process?
Well, I think I said it depends on how big the problem that you've got in front of you. Like if someone's extremely sore or really injured and it seems to be very biomechanically related, then you probably can be a bit more aggressive with the intervention you put in place.
It's probably necessary in that sense.
Unless you change it, they're probably not going to get. And we've spoken about this before when we talk about, the magnitude of stress that you need to have to actually create an intervention that's useful for something that's very far away from, say, some sort of, optimal state. I say that in inverted commas, close to an optimal state. And so because the principles of biomechanics are based on the physical laws, there is a closer to optimal state than maybe some other things that have much more complex kind of underpinnings. So with that in mind, I think it just comes down to how much is this affecting them, whether it be an injury or a performance. That gives you an idea of maybe how aggressive you need to be. And sometimes it's timeline related as well. If we all know this, for instance, if someone's in a lot of pain and they've got to compete in a competition in 2 days, then we're having a lot of medical input to actually get their pain relief sorted much sooner than if they don't need to compete for another 6 months. We're happy to use a much more, gentle approach on even pain management.
Yep.
If they're in reasonable pain, say 5 out of 10 for the next 3 days, you will accept that because the timeline and the time horizon of them competing is 6 months away. But if it's 2 days away, 5 out of 10 is not going to cut it. So you need to actually bring medical support in to say, hey, can we get some strong pain relief for these couple of days because they need to compete at this point. I think it's similar. It's like, what's your time horizon? How significant is the effect that it's having on performance or injury? And, how significant do I see this asymmetry or incongruence to be?
So with that in mind, how do you go about training someone to change the mechanics? Are there particular principles or practices that you use for skill acquisition that are more effective than others?
Yeah, well, I think, this comes down to any learning, right? And I think learning physical skills are not really that different from learning, knowledge-based skills. But essentially, we know there's some general principles with this, and there's literature obviously in the motor learning world, but we know that, for instance, ideas like the more specific the task is, the more transfer it's going to have. So people love drills, but drills are contextual information, right? I use a lot of drills to give that contextual. Might be some, this is what this should feel like. This is what this posture should feel like. This is where, when you hit the ground, it should feel like this with your foot or ankle. But that's not the task. The thing that's going to transfer the most is the task itself. Now, it doesn't mean you don't use drills, but don't get it twisted, as they say. You're not going to get someone to get faster just because they did drills.
It's like step one in the process.
It's giving them some background information. If we've obviously spoken to your brother as a musician, it's like learning scales. It's like, if you get really good at scales, does that mean that you're the best musician out there? Probably not.
No, but part of it is actually being able to identify and develop patterns.
Yes.
Because I think that's a good example with music. I remember asking Tom, why do scales? It seems so irrelevant. He goes, no, because these are patterns that you see in pieces.
Yes.
So that's why you do it. So you're actually developing that, muscle memory, if you want to call it.
Exactly. And that's how people should see drills. They're very important, but they're not going to be the thing that turns you into Mozart.
Yes.
Right? So understand that. The next feature, actually, remind me where we were going with
I was thinking about how we actually teach change biomechanics.
So I think that the key thing that you need to think of, we said you need to understand that it needs to be specific. That's the first part. The second part that you need to understand is it follows what we call a power law curve. The more you do, the better you will get. However, there are caveats on that. And the work of, say, someone like Anders Ericsson tells us that if you want to get the most learning to occur, it needs to be they talk about deliberate practice. And deliberate practice for most people, I don't know that most of us are used to what that is, but it's where you're doing the task, you're getting feedback, you're then using that to constructively input back into what you're doing with the continued practice, and you're doing that over and over and over and over and over again. It's the reason why, if you are a runner, you should have a coach watching what you do. Yes,
it's not just about going through the actual physical motions, but also then the cognitive analysis and input, both from yourself but also other people. And there is a psychological challenge with this, because deliberate practice is actually psychologically very challenging. You never feel like you're on top of something because you're always moving the goalposts. The moment you get something, you try to
push them a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further, because what you're trying to do is continuously develop that skill to a higher level of understanding or higher level of proficiency or automaticity. As you said, it's like getting those patterns to be as close to automatically generated. So you're trying to push that. So it needs to be specific. You need to do as much of it as you can, and you need to make sure that when you practice it, it's very deliberate in how you do it and it's constructive. You're getting feedback. Now, if you put that in context, the thing that we know as well from the motor learning research is that distributed practice is more effective than mass practice. So what I mean by that is, rather than doing 17 hours of running mechanics drills, you're probably better to do 1 hour a day for the next 17 days, right? And most of us know that if you're learning anything, you're better off to do an hour a day than to do 10 hours in one day and then not look at it again for the next 10 days.
Yep.
Right? So that's obviously, there's cognitive factors that are associated with that, with laying down memory and laying down the connections between those neural circuits and different parts of your brain and how that all fits together. But it's important to actually break that up. And even if you're doing a lot in one day, it's intelligent to take breaks, to give yourself the opportunity to break that up. And then I think the things that you need to think about from the other principles of how you're going to teach that is, okay, what kind of environment am I creating for that individual? So, I'm sure there's probably teachers listening to that laughing because I'm talking about ideas around pedagogy now. And what you want to look at with this is, okay, what kind of learning do I want? Do I want implicit or an explicit learning? And we spoke about this on a running podcast not that long ago. But, implicit learning is the type of learning where you're not necessarily understanding how it's coming about. You're implicitly understanding those features. It's not necessarily having to be explained to you. You're exploring the environment, whether that be a certain task, whether it be a game, whether it be some sort of environment that's been created for you to explore, and you're picking up on that and then being able to use that in your skill.
Almost like internal feedback.
Yes. Then there's obviously explicit learning where, it's what we call like that declarative learning. Someone's actually physically telling you, do this, try this, explore this. Now, what we know is that generally implicit learning creates better long-term adaptation for skill acquisition, right? But it's not that explicit learning is not valuable. So don't think that you can't use explicit learning, but you often see very high-level coaches, for instance, not say very much. And people think, well, why aren't they doing anything? Are they not doing their job? But what they're actually allowing is for that implicit learning environment to be created for that athlete.
So essentially you're really allowing them to problem solve effectively. They're not relying on the external input from you or another person for that.
Yeah. And one of the ways in which you can do and set up this implicit learning, like I would say explicit learning is very much that sort of instructional type learning. It might be a demonstration, then an instruction, then feedback, and then you just rinse and repeat. Yep. Now, it's not to say that's not effective. It can be very effective. And particularly for beginners, it might be the way in which you need to actually give them, as you said, some of that foundational information, develop some of those even patterns of understanding. The next part is, with implicit learning, is to try and create environments. So a lot of the things, one of the ones that's become really popular is constraints-based learning. Right? And constraints-based learning is providing obstacles for people to have to try and solve problems in their physical space, in this example, to be able to come up with motor solutions. So in running, one of the key ones that we talk about a lot, say if someone is overstriding, is to potentially use things like wicket drills. A lot of people have seen that with mini hurdles or cones, to give them an indication of, okay, for my height, what should my stride length approximately be? And they can use that visual cue and run over the cones or hurdles to be able to do that. And that gives them that feedback, as you said, that internal feedback to be able to do so. So those are kind of some of the features you do. Now, you mentioned internal and external feedback before. That's obviously related to the instructions that you're giving someone. I know we've mentioned this at different times in different podcasts, but internal feedback being feedback around what actually they're doing with their body and internal to their movement or their anatomy itself, and then external feedback being external to their body. So an example of each would be if someone's running along and you say, okay, move your foot here, or in this direction, or lift your toes, or whatever it is, versus, I want you to bounce off the ground, or I want you to push the ground away from you, or I want you to shift towards the sky when you bounce off the ground, something like that. So you're giving them an external kind of focus. And what the research tends to show is that in less experienced athletes, external cueing works much better than internal cueing. There does seem to be a bit of a crossover that occurs that as someone gets more experience, particularly if they have anatomical knowledge, that a combination of both probably works just as well.
Yeah, I think part of that too is your focus. Is it your focus on a particular region, or is it global output?
Yes.
Because I think that's the other thing, because, think of someone like myself who has very little running ability. You could give me external cues and I would try to find a strategy to maximize output based on my tissue capacity and so on. But there may be clear issues of you've got really poor ankle stiffness. So there are going to be many times where I need you to focus on this particular element of your foot. So I think that's where sometimes people can get undone with looking at the research, because although the external attentional focus certainly leads to better outcomes in force output, long term you typically only have to use a combination of both to develop the appropriate or best patterns for that person and develop the biomechanical patterns that you want.
And I think we've been going an hour already, so I think we'd be remiss to not actually talk about some specific presentations and specific injuries.
And the common ones that you would see
too.
Are
there any in mind that you think you should definitely address?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is looking at foot and ankle mechanics, because it's such a big component, a big pattern that you see that's...
Yeah, but I mean specific injuries.
Oh, okay. Well, look, perhaps we work on two ends of the spectrum. So let's think about in distance runners. I think a really common one would be related to Achilles tendon pain. And thinking about, are there particular biomechanical patterns that predispose you to that? And if so, what are the kind of strategies that people need to adopt to change that?
Yeah, so from the research that I've done, it seems like the most common biomechanical factor, there are obviously other tissue property factors that contribute significantly to Achilles tendon, but the most common one is that during the mid-stance and the late portion of mid-stance before push-off, they end up in a much deeper dorsiflexion position.
Yep.
And they consistently do that. So if you imagine someone running and you're looking at it from the side, you're seeing that their ankle is very, their foot and their shin are coming much closer together.
So I guess you would see then overall quite a drop in their centre of gravity as a result.
Yes, you see a drop in their centre of gravity. You see their knee bend more, their hip bend more.
Yeah.
And that tends to be the biggest biomechanical thing that I tend to see if someone develops a lot of Achilles pain from distance running, is that they tend to over yield at the ankle and end up in a lot of dorsiflexion, particularly through that mid stance and that late phase of stance. Now, it's not to say that you shouldn't have that yielding. The reason you need that, right? You need in order to...
You can't be rigid.
Can't be rigid because you need to store energy within those structures of the Achilles, of the plantar fascia.
And dissipate forces through the myofascial system, not just actually creating longitudinal load through the articular system.
Exactly. And without doing that, and people often think I think it's one of those things, it got brought up not that long ago in one of our sessions of, pronation's good, pronation's bad. Where does that sit? It's we know that you need to be able to have rotation about the ankle, to have inversion, eversion, and the ability for you to use, for instance, that flattening of the arch as a propulsive mechanism through that pronation is extremely important, because it actually lines up the position of your Achilles.
Yes.
To be able to actually propel, to be able to use that stored elastic energy.
It's some of that interesting research looking at the twisted nature of the Achilles tendon and how that changes its morphological shape based on foot mechanics.
So to think that there shouldn't be some movement and rotation about that ankle is probably a little bit simplistic. But the thing that is clear is if someone has excessive dorsiflexion and it's a consistent thing, and you don't seem to see them being able to bounce off the ground well. So we talk about, stiffness,
active stiffness,
and that elastic function. If someone is really sinking into the ground and ending up in a lot of that position of increased dorsiflexion, that tends to be a biomechanical feature, right? And this is the same even actually for people. We say this is the same as for sprinting. Sprinters who develop Achilles pain, which is very common, are the ones who really collapse through their ankle, leak a lot of energy for performance, and end up in a really heavily dorsiflex position through that mid-stance phase.
And so this is also probably a good example where here's a common biomechanical pattern associated with this pathology, but in terms of how you address that, it comes back to that same framework we talked about before in terms of looking at the spatiotemporal components, the kinematic, the kinetic components, because the strategy or strategies that you implement are probably going to vary from person to person.
Yeah, like everyone knows, particularly, or not everyone knows, but particularly with something like Achilles, like most of us are going to try and look at some of the tissue properties. We're going to try and look at, okay, do they have strength capability? Do they have endurance capability? Do they have the ability to bounce and jump, and have a look at measures like their reactive strength ratio or reactive strength index to get an idea of like, okay, can they actually use these things? If they do, and you're scratching your head thinking, well, they're not weak, they're not inelastic, what's going on? It means that they don't actually know how to coordinate those features, and they're allowing themselves to dump down into that position.
Yep.
Like even earlier today, I was listening to a podcast with a coach that I've mentioned many a time, Dan Pfaff, and he got, asked about running mechanics stuff, and he's talking about dorsiflexion in sprinting. And he was saying, like over the years, they've collected a lot of data that basically has shown, particularly in the upright phase, athletes who don't actually have the ability to control their dorsiflexion and are landing with too forward of a point of contact. They're landing not at the back of the ball of the foot, through the midfoot. They're landing closer to that forefoot, tend to develop not only more injuries, but actually their performance is reduced. And the big reason that he talks about the performance reduction is a big feature that I talk about quite often when people ask, like, oh, what should my foot strike be? And we spoke about, physical laws before. There are some, biological ones that are also interesting to put into pieces with this. So, you mentioned before the distribution of the ground reaction forces across the different, myofascial networks. And if you are to cut down the point of contact, you're therefore concentrating the force application through a much smaller surface area, which actually means you're often getting an uneven distribution of that force across that myofascial network. And that in itself can be a major factor for the development of overuse in particular areas. So the instruction that I typically give a lot of people, which they probably think is weird, is particularly for distance runners, is like, just put your whole foot on the ground. Don't try to be landing on your rear foot or your midfoot or your forefoot. Actually, just put the whole thing down. And from a really, really basic fundamental engineering physical laws perspective, the greater the surface area, the easier it is to distribute those forces across more tissue. And that's going to create a better foundation for you to be able to actually do that.
Yeah, and I think that highlights a point too, that if you want to maintain performance at a high level, ground reaction forces are going to be high.
Yeah.
It's not like you can defy physical laws. And I think that's probably...
We know that the energy doesn't get, removed. It's not destroyed, as they say.
Yeah, exactly.
It
and
has
even
to go somewhere.
Well, I think that's probably one of the perhaps limitations, although it may have application at times, is an increase in just, say, stride frequency, which typically is going to reduce your stride length, is going to lead to a smaller ground reaction force. But there's two elements to that of, one, implications on performance, because we need to use that ground reaction force to propel ourselves forward. But then also, even if the magnitude of force is going down, the cycle is actually going up. So the reality is the combination or accumulation of forces may create changes in that injury profile, as long as it's not actually reducing performance to a detrimental state.
Yeah, so you're 100% right. So those are, I think, are the features that are major contributors to the development of that calf, Achilles, and even foot. Like a lot of bone stress stuff in the feet tends to be related to a very similar sort of feature.
Well, perhaps for the next one, instead of thinking a particular pathology, perhaps a particular biomechanical pattern of overstriding, because that's obviously a very common thing that's seen too as well.
Yeah, so overstriding obviously is common. And one of the things that...
It's actually probably worth even just defining what that is, because I think it's probably a good starting point.
Well, I think overstriding is, and it's hard, I actually don't have a really good definition for you in terms of quantifying it. Basically, it's any point in which someone is landing at a significant distance ahead of their center of mass would be considered overstriding. I think the easiest way to define it from a quantifiable standpoint is in steady state running, and I say steady state, that can either be maximal steady state or say an endurance event where you're not trying to get fast, you're just running along at the same speed, or you're going as fast as you can and your state is uniform, there's no acceleration or deceleration, which doesn't, I won't get into the technicalities of that. The thing that is usually a consideration for overstriding is where your shank angle, so the angle at your knee in relation to the ground, is not vertical. Any time in which you're doing that, you're actually effectively overstriding.
And so essentially the point of contact is in front of the center of gravity, which you think about force vectors, creates that braking force as you described before.
Yeah, so if you're creating a braking force at the point of contact, right, then you are overstriding.
Yep.
Right, so I think that's probably, I haven't looked into this, but that's probably the definition of it. So if someone is doing that, you've got two options, right? You're either, as you said, you're effectively going to change their skill set of what they do in the air so that they reposition their limbs quick enough to be able to then project their center of mass further forward, and therefore if they put their leg down, it's actually the same, the stride length hasn't changed, but the distance is the same, and they're able to put it down with a vertical shin. Or you can instruct them and develop the skills for them to actually land with a vertical shin, right? And it's some of that may have to do with repositioning, but it's sometimes got to do with the force application, giving them a little bit more time in the air to reposition. And that's one of the common things that we see is at faster running speeds, flight time increases and the vertical forces remain high. And the reason the vertical forces are high is you need time to reposition your limbs effectively. Now, they don't want to be too high where you're just bouncing and then staying in the air forever. But typically you're trying to give yourself an opportunity to reposition your limb so that you've got time to effectively then reapply that vertical force through that vertical shin angle. And if you don't have that shin angle vertical and you have a braking force, so you have then a decelerative force, and that probably means your center of mass is further forward, what ends up happening typically is we see an increase in that yielding that happens at the foot, knee and ankle because the forces are higher, right? Through that braking, there's more eccentric load that has to happen. And the reason that that increases is because as the distance away from the center of mass gets further forward, that front side distance, which is the distance between center of mass and where the point of contact is, you're increasing the lever length at which the tissues of, say, the lower limb need to be able to reduce the gravitational force. So if you really, and we all know this, if you stick your leg out really, really far and you try and land in that position, you'll sink and collapse straight away. Right? Whereas if you land directly underneath yourself, if you jump up and down on the spot, you can pretty much land with a rigid limb. If you throw your leg out really far ahead, you won't be able to do that because the levers are at a mechanical disadvantage. So the reason that that happens, you see more collapse, is you end up having, those tissues are not at a mechanical advantage. And for that reason, we see over-yielding. And over-yielding present as too much movement at the ankle will probably give us overload through the foot, including whether that be the joint structure itself, the tendons around the foot and ankle. So peroneal tendons are common, tibialis posterior. Obviously, the plantar fascia also is a major one that tends to be heavily influenced too by the mechanics and the kinematics of the toes. If you have very poor movement and extension of the big toe, that can be a major factor for the development of plantar fascia pain. As we just spoke about before, you end up getting that over-yielding in the ankle leads to increased dorsiflexion, which will overload the tissues of the calf, Achilles, and those are the things that the reason that you're having the issue is you throw it out, you yield a lot, then you have to re-propel yourself. So it's actually asking that tissue to go under enormous amount of stretch at that really long position, have to store that energy and then try and use it from a long length to then, which is a mechanical disadvantage, to then try and re-propel the body. So it makes sense why it overloads. Yeah,
you're actually starting to work the soft tissue system at angles and in lengths that it's actually not really designed to do, essentially.
Then if we go up the chain, if we look at the knee, we see over yielding at the knee, which can often be associated with overstriding, right? Because it's exactly what we spoke about with these levers. And we see the two major developments that we see usually are ITB pain or patellofemoral pain. Sometimes we will see tendon overload, but that tends to be a little bit more related to jumping sports.
Yeah, exactly.
We do see it sometimes. So those are the same thing. You know, if it's more in that frontal plane and that transverse plane, we see a little bit, you know, of an increase maybe in ITB stuff. If it's more in that sagittal plane, it's usually a bit more of that patellofemoral type pain. But we know that obviously when you're yielding, you're not just yielding in one plane. It's a 360 degree, you know, movement.
Three-dimensional, yeah.
Yeah. So, and then at the hip, the thing that we tend to see is either, the big one that we tend to see is particularly in older and sometimes, you know, females, we see like gluteal tendinopathy development. But the other big one that we see with overstriding is the development of proximal hamstring tendinopathy, especially when people do have an overstriding pattern and they decide they're going to run hills or undulating surfaces, which means that there's also potentially a compressive component to that upper hamstring through that movement as well.
Through the forward tilt of the trunk. Yeah.
So overstriding leads to those kind of things.
Yeah, okay.
In a sprint athlete or an athlete that does, you know, sprints as part of their, say, field sport, the thing that you tend to get with overstriding typically is hamstring strains. That tends to be the most common presentation. And again, it's as we said, you're asking the posterior structures of the leg, i.e. the hamstring, to be able to have to absorb, store, release a large amount of energy from a mechanical disadvantaged position.
You're literally putting more strain through the hamstring.
Yeah.
And that's where you're most susceptible to soft tissue injuries.
Yeah. Is there any others that you wanted to go through that are common presentations that, you know, we've spoken about Achilles, we've spoken about overstriding and how that maybe potentially influences bone stress or...
Yeah, I think we've talked a little bit about other elements too when we think about, say, ITB syndrome. So I think we're highlighting some of the key ones there. So, you know, given that we've been going now for almost an hour 20, we should probably wrap it up.
Yeah. If you have questions out of this, you know, don't hesitate to send through any ideas or questions you might have. There's obviously lots of other biomechanical features that people have studied and researched that demonstrate some of the different presentations that we see. But we thought we would go through a little bit more of like how we assess some of those things ourselves and some of the things we look at, because it's really clearly obvious to us that you can use basic principles to observe, collect, assess, and then make some changes. Thank you very much for joining us.